under his cloak he carried a bow, all for to shoot a merry little doe among the leaves so green. Oh,
Jackie boy,
master, very well, go down, derry, derry, down among the leaves so green. Oh,
Do my hay down, down.
oh, down, down,
Hey down.
oh, down, derry, derry, down among the leaves so green. Oh, do my hay down, down, do my oh, down, down, hey down, oh, down, derry, derry, down among the leaves so green. Oh.
For centuries, wild deer roamed the forest and hilllands of Europe. In Britain, in the Middle Ages, they were considered to belong to the king, and hunting them was strictly a royal privilege. If rich barons wanted to enclose a herd within their own land, well, then they had to have royal permission, and they paid a royal price for it too. Only outlaws stole deer for its meat, outlaws like Robin Hood. Stag hunting provides good meat, but because hunters often want trophies, they take great pride in killing the master stag, the one with the most splendid horns. In the Middle Ages, books were written often by monks, and in them the stag is often said to represent Christians. This one says, "These creatures, when they feel themselves weighed down by sickness, suck serpents from their holes in the ground with a snort from their nostrils. After eating the snakes, they shed their coats and all their old age with them. Similarly," it says, "when Christians snuff up the devil snake of sin, they run with confession to our Lord Jesus Christ and shed their old age of sin." Well, stags don't eat snakes at all. They feed on grass and young shoots. But they are one of the horned animals that seem to have collected many odd legends. Every year in Staffordshire, on the first Sunday of September, in the village of Abbots Bromley, a very ancient ceremony is played out. With one lot of horns painted black and the other white, the men of the village dance their way for 20 miles all around the village boundaries. It looks like a quaint old custom, but the dance itself goes back to the ancient pagan fertility rites of harvest time. The horns are said to be at least 1,000 years old and to have come from Scandinavia with the Vikings. The black and white horns symbolize the fight between light and dark, between winter and spring. A battle that was very much a part of Viking mythology. But the idea of wearing the horns of the animal you hunt isn't only a magical practice, it can have a quite practical purpose too. In Britain, the largest of our native wild deer is the red deer. An adult stag stands 4 feet high and its antlers can be 3 feet across. Most horns are hollow, but deer antlers are solid all through, and every year in spring they're cast, dropped off, and a fresh set grows. When they're new, they are covered in velvet, a kind of soft skin. In the late summer, this starts to wear off, and the animals rub the rest off against trees and on the ground, hardening their horns for fighting. Perhaps it was the tatters of summer velvet, which people once thought were serpents. Certainly, by the time all the velvet is off, the deer are fighting fit. For most of the year, the males and the females live apart. But in the autumn, when the breeding season starts, the adult males fight for the right to be master. There's a lot of bellowing and crashing and banging, and the fights can last for up to half an hour. But it's really only a show of strength. The strongest wins, and wins the right to all the females. but he has to keep on bellowing just to make sure the others continue to recognize him as king. Some people claim that medicine taken from a deer horn spoon like this one, or drunk from a horn cup, is better for you. And it was said that burning deer horns was powerful magic to keep snakes away. And once people believed that powdered deer horn mixed with grease was a sure magical ointment. The connection between animals and magic seems to go back as far into history as anything we know. Primitive men painted the walls of their caves with pictures of animals, many of them horned beasts. They seemed to be more than just simple portraits. Perhaps there was some magic ritual, a way to get the gods to increase the number of animals for hunting and to increase the strength of the men who hunted them. And of all the animals that they painted, this huge wild bull takes pride of place. We think of cattle as farm animals, but once they were wild. When Julius Caesar first wrote about the tribes living in the forests of Germany, he wrote about the auroch, a wild black bull, nearly as large as an elephant, though in shape and colour resembling a bull. They spare neither man nor beast that comes in their way. They are hunted chiefly by the young men who preserve the horns with great care, decorating the rims with silver, and at their most solemn festivals they drink from them instead of cups. But these huge wild bulls were hunted mercilessly, and by the 16th century there were only about 30 of the great aurochs left, living in the forests of Lithuania. One by one they died off, and within 50 years there were none left at all. But in this country it was often white cattle that were killed by the young men at solemn festivals, white bulls with black horns and red ears, known by the Welsh poets as fairy cattle or magic cattle. 2,000 years ago, when the Romans came to Britain, they brought with them some of their religious beliefs, and one of them was the worship of a Persian god, Mithras. It seems to have been something of a secret religion. Underground temples to Mithras have been found wherever the Roman armies settled. The symbol of Mithras was a white bull, which was ceremonially stabbed to death, and from its blood new crops were expected to grow. This is a reconstruction of a Mithraic temple discovered in Northumberland. It's one of several of these secret altars found along the Great Wall that the Roman armies built straight across the northern counties of England. Less than 50 miles away from that temple, here in the Cheviot Hills, where there are still remains of Roman encampments waiting to be explored, there lives the last herd of wild white cattle in Britain. They could even be descendants of the wild bulls that were specially bred for sacrifice in the Roman temples to Mithras. The written records of this herd go back some 700 years, when the lord of the castle here at Chillingham was given royal permission to enclose within his park the wild cattle that roamed on the moorlands. And that herd has remained here ever since, totally wild. They don't like people, and in particular, they hate the smell of people. If you are foolish enough to go in amongst them, they'd almost certainly attack you. But you can visit them in safety with the warden of the Chillingham estate, Douglas Redpath.
They have their own way of living in the park. They live completely as a herd. They have their own herd laws, their rules. They have a king bull. And now this animal leads the herd. He's responsible for their breeding. He's solely responsible for the breeding, the king bull. He's had to fight his way there, rather like the stags with the herds of red deer, where the stags fight among themselves. So do the king bulls in this park. And so he'll remain in charge until he's eventually challenged and defeated by a younger and stronger bull.
And how long is his reign, as it were?
Well, it's difficult to really assess an average, but we estimate probably 18 months, 2 years perhaps.
Really?
Yes.
Yeah. And then his time is over.
His time is over.
And what does he do? Does he go out into the other part of the park? Or
well, yes. Invariably, when a king bull has been defeated, he spends a period in exile.
Yes.
Probably 6 or 8 weeks off, he'll go and live on his own. And provided he comes back quietly and behaves himself, they'll take him back into the herd again. They're very vicious, these battles, for dominance of the herd particularly. But on the other hand, of course, an awful lot of fighting takes place among the younger bulls. They have to fight among themselves, of course, to find out their own strengths and weaknesses. But this fight for the leadership of the herd can be very vicious. It's very short-lived. The build-up or the prelude to it is the thing that takes the time, but the actual contact may only last 3 or 4 minutes.
What happens in the prelude?
Well, first of all, the bull that's thinking about challenging the king, he'll come out in front of the herd. He'll start bellowing, making a tremendous bellowing noise. He'll paw the ground with his front hooves. He'll bear a patch of earth, and then he'll get down on his front haunches, rub his neck and shoulders through it. And that's his way of saying, well, come on, I'm ready for you now. So the old king will come out, and he'll do the same. And then they'll spar around. They'll stand almost alongside each other, perhaps, for several minutes. And what they're doing, in fact, is watching for an unguarded moment in the other animal. And when one of them thinks he's found it, then he'll make a lunge. They'll make contact. From then on, it'll be a question of strength, really pushing with their head and
Do
horns.
they ever injure one another?
Well, they do, unfortunately, yes. They go 1 or 2 nasty gashes, particularly along their flank and around about the facial area. It's quite possible for me to come up here in the mornings and find blood pouring from a wound.
Really?
It really is.
Do they kill one another?
This is very rare, but it has been known. There were 2 bulls killed in 1953, actually, fighting.
And they won't allow you to go in to give them help, will they?
Well, we can get in beside them, of course. We often have to go into the park, but it's not easy to help these animals, not to come into physical contact with them. This is the great problem. We're not able to come into physical contact with them.
You mean nobody ever touches them?
They're never touched from the day they're born to the day they die. They never handle these animals.
Do they get everything they require by way of food in the park here?
Well, in weather like this, of course, we have to supplement them a little bit. When there's very little growing in the park, everything's dead, really, and dormant. So we put out a little bit of hay each morning for them.
Well, they look as though they're actually hoping that you're going to provide them a bit just now.
Well, I am going to.
Shall we
yes.
go and do it?
We'll go and do some now.
How many are there?
51 at the moment.
That's a very small number. Have there been any less than that?
Well, they have indeed, yes. 28 years ago, in 1947, they were down to the lowest ever numbers of 13. Almost on the point of extinction.
Was that because of disease or what?
No, it's because of the dreadful winter we had here. 20 out of 33 died because of the amount of snow that was falling on the estate. It was virtually impossible to move here. And so before it could be brought up in sufficient quantities, 20 had already died.
What about foot and mouth?
Well, foot and mouth disease has never been in the park as far as we know. 9 years ago, it surrounded this place, never came in. There's no way of knowing for sure, of course, whether these animals are immune to it without fully exposing them to it, and that's the last thing in the world we can afford to do. So we do take drastic measures. Now, if foot and mouth disease is recorded anywhere in the British Isles, this park is closed immediately to all visitors.
Well, indeed, because if this disappeared, then purebred white cattle, British white cattle, would disappear altogether.
They're the only herd of purebred wild cattle anywhere in the world. Absolutely unique.
In 1790, Thomas Bewick, the British naturalist, went to visit the Chillingham cattle. He was writing a book, A History of Quadrupeds, and making drawings. Bewick says it was too difficult for him to get near enough to the reigning king to draw him, and this drawing is of an old, defeated king bull. He also describes a bull hunt at Chillingham. The mode of killing them was perhaps the only modern remains of the grandeur of ancient hunting. On notice being given that a wild bull would be killed on a certain day, the inhabitants of the neighborhood came mounted and armed with guns, while the horsemen rode off the bull from the rest of the herd until he stood at bay. Then a marksman dismounted and shot, to the shouts of savage joy echoing from every side. The last of these bull hunts took place in 1872, when the young man who was to become Edward VII shot a Chillingham bull with a rifle. A different sort of bull hunt still takes place today in Spain. It used to be said that white bulls were sacrificed to the good gods and black bulls to the evil ones. The ceremonial fighting of bulls seems to have been a ritual that goes back into the dim, distant past. The earliest picture of a Spanish bullfight is in the 13th century. Whether it was the Romans who brought it first to Spain, no one is quite sure. But long before the Romans sacrificed bulls to their gods, bulls were brought garlanded to different altars, sometimes to be worshipped, sometimes to be sacrificed. Among the splendid remains of King Minos's palace in Crete, this bull-horn altar was discovered. And these bull statues and heads, sometimes in gold and sometimes in bronze. Certainly in Crete, the bull was a sacred animal. And this fantastic painting from the same palace of King Minos shows young boys and girls, acrobats, leaping over an enormous bull, a particularly dangerous form of bullfight in which the bull is always the winner. So, to the people of the East, cattle have long been connected with religious practices. In the Nile Valley, when a sacred cow died, it was buried in the ground with just its horns protruding from the earth. And even today, for Hindus, the flesh of cattle is forbidden food. It may be difficult for us to understand this. If you're hungry, why shouldn't you eat a beef steak? But it's easier to understand if we think how shocked we are at the thought of eating horses. And yet the food value of horseflesh is quite as good. It's been said that once upon a time to the ancient Britons the horse was a sacred animal. The huge pictures of white horses drawn on our chalk downs are traces of that belief. And even now we still treat horses with something of the respect of ancient gods. We even stick garlands on them. And we would have to be very hungry indeed, I think, before we would think of eating them. I've talked about deer horns and bull horns, but not yet about the most fabulous horned beast of all, the unicorn. The old story of the unicorn is that it was a rare and admirable beast, hardly ever seen because it lived alone on the edge of the world. It had a single horn on its forehead, and it was beautiful like a white horse, but strong, fierce, and quite untamable. The way to catch one was to take a young maiden into the forest and leave her there alone. And when the wild unicorn scented her presence, he would come quietly and lay his head in her lap and allow himself to be caught. And then the hunters would take him to the king's palace, where they cut off his horn by force and sent him away alive. That was the story, told as a true story, by the Greeks and Romans, and repeated again and again throughout the Middle Ages. It was a very favourite fable, but one that was always being questioned. When Marco Polo returned from his journey to China, he described having seen plenty of unicorns, though he seemed disappointed in what he saw. They're ugly brutes to look at, and not at all as we described them, he said. They have the hair of the buffalo and feet like elephants. Well, it wasn't the first time that the rhinoceros and the unicorn was to be confused. But there is a Chinese version of the unicorn story. By tradition, it's an almost fairy-like creature that appears only to kings, gentle and harmless, with a voice like the sound of monastery bells. This little wooden figure of a unicorn is Chinese, and it's nearly 2,000 years old. There's a story that when the great Genghis Khan was leading his army of warriors on a raid through the Himalayan mountains, they caught sight of such a unicorn. Slowly it bowed its head 3 times, which so frightened that fierce army that they turned and marched away. There's another story that the Caliph of Mecca kept a pair of unicorns in his palace gardens, a gift from the king of Ethiopia. But the holy city of Mecca was forbidden to Europeans, so no one had ever seen them. But the real reason that people searched across continents for the mysterious unicorn was for the sake of its magical horn, the alicorn as it was called. The very smallest piece of alicorn, dipped in water, was said to guard you absolutely against any kind of poison. And once no king or prince worth his salt was without at least a piece of true unicorn's horn among his family treasures. This was their test to discover whether an alicorn was genuine or not. Place the horn in a vessel, and with it 3 or 4 live and large scorpions, keeping it covered. If you find 4 hours later that the scorpions are dead or almost lifeless, the alicorn's a good one, and there's not enough money in the whole world to pay for it. In the 16th century, an alicorn was indeed worth more than 3 times its own weight in gold. And the extraordinary thing was that everybody had an alicorn. There were some in Paris, in Rome, in Venice, in Constantinople, and among the English crown jewels at Windsor, there was a silver-tipped unicorn's horn, 7 feet long. Then it was valued at £100,000. The modern equivalent would be over £1 million. Well, I've been lent this unicorn's horn by the Wellcome Museum of Medical History. Right up until 200 years ago, the Royal Society of Physicians included unicorn horns as part of the essential list of drugs for any chemist on their register. But where did they get all these elaborately spiraled unicorn horns from? Certainly not from a unicorn. Well, the history of the Elizabethan Windsor horn is known. It was found washed up on the shores of Frobisher's Bay in Canada and presented to the Crown. A right royal gift from the King of the Sea to the Queen of England, perhaps. Anyway, that's where it did come from. The alicorn came from a whale. They were the single tusks of this strange-looking creature, the narwhal, not an uncommon whale. Now they're worth about £60 in curiosity value. But though eventually the virtues of the alicorn were abandoned, people's interest in the legend of the unicorn continued. Travellers from the New World of the Americas reported having seen them there. Single-horned goats are still part of Red Indian legend. In the 19th century, French explorers reported seeing unicorns in Africa and made drawings of them. And over again, travellers from Tibet produced stories of the unicorns of the Himalayas, until a few years ago, this statue of a single-horned gazelle decorated the roof of the royal palace of the Dalai Lama. Perhaps that was what had been seen. Certainly, the story of the existence of a true unicorn was only reluctantly dismissed as a beautiful but mythical legend. And then, in 1933, an American biologist called Dr. Franklin Dove did a simple experiment. He took a young bull calf and grafted one of its horn buds onto the front of its head. Quite a simple operation. But the graft took, and the calf grew up to be a one-horned bull. But that wasn't all that happened. This bull grew very big and strong and fierce, and the rest of the herd treated it as a king. Having one horn instead of 2 seemed to mark it out as the lead animal. Perhaps in the past, different tribes in different areas of Ethiopia and North America and Tibet knew the secret of this simple operation and were able to plan and choose their own king animals for their herds. And because it was a technique unknown to Europeans, they thought it must be some sort of magic and named these creatures unicorns. Who knows? Part of the old unicorn legend is that he is a leader of other animals. The story says that when all the creatures of the forest came to the spring to drink, they wait until the king, the unicorn, has dipped his horn into the water to purify it before the rest of them dare to quench their thirst. His single horn sets him apart, a leader, almost like magic.